Hello, I'm Stephanie Beloris, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I'm joined by Vice President and Principal Analyst Andras Chair and Principal Analyst Jeff Carnes to discuss how close we are to finally killing the dreaded password. Welcome both.
Thanks. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, great to be here.
Okay, so let's just start right off with how realistic is it? Are there options for removing passwords for both consumers as well as employees? What do you think, Andras? Consumers first?
Consumer first is all good. We are seeing the biggest password killer. 502 passkeys are just taking the industry by, firestorm. There's a lot of deployments, we'll probably talk about those, but even without using, the FIDO passkey combo and FIDO passkey infrastructure, we've seen biometrics, we've seen mobile applications being used for authentication, one-time passwords sent to email addresses, or one-time use links sent to email addresses, SMS text messages with one-time passwords, or SMS text messages with email links, all there. So one-time use links sent to SMS text inboxes.
Let me jump in there. So you mentioned passkeys. Give me an example of a passkey. How are they being used today for consumers?
Sure. So a passkey is, for example, you want to log in, for example, into the Adobe website, right? It's today an optional feature that after a successful authentication using your legacy username, typical email address, and password, and receiving an SMS text message for two-factor authentication, Adobe website, will offer that, hey, would you like to never use your password anymore, right? And it will then prompt you and guide you through, as a user, through the passkey creation process, which typically would involve having an iOS or Apple iPhone or an Android mobile phone, and basically will prompt you to actually establish the passkey on either one of these mobile devices, right? And then from that point on, once you establish your passkey, you generated it, it will be stored in the Apple keychain, or it will be stored in the Google Password Manager. And then from that point on, you're able to log in and authenticate into the site without actually having to use your password. But your password still stays, right?
But when you come to the site, like, what do you see and what do you have to do?
So you may see a login with passkey capability. You may see a QR code that you have to scan, and you take out your mobile phone, scan that QR code, and then basically your device will prompt you that, this site is asking you to log in. Would you like to log in? And then you have to use your Face ID or Touch ID or your Apple password or Google password. And then you release it. So you approve the login, and then you'll be logged in. Basically, that's the user experience. That's simple.
Okay. I guess what I'm hearing, though, and Jeff, feel free to jump in anytime, but like you mentioned passkeys and you gave us a couple examples, and I've used these personally for various sites, streaming services, they've come in handy. You mentioned mobile authentication, one-time passwords, but in all these scenarios, you still do need a user ID and password to start, and you're still storing that somewhere.
With a lot of the mechanisms today, yeah, it still goes back to having a password at some point in that process to get enabled or enrolled. I think over time there are options where that can fade to the background to enroll directly into passkeys as part of your onboarding process or whatnot, but we're not there yet. And that's coming at it mostly from a workforce side of things, from my perspective.
So yeah, and everything you just described, like at the end of the day, you still do, at least today, you still need a username and password to start. And I also find too, like, again, someone who, and I think we've all used like passkeys, it still also does periodically require you to remember your username and password. So you still have to either remember it, have it written down somewhere, or you're using one of these password managers, as you mentioned.
Yes, so the 502 passkeys infrastructure, right, requires, and this is a big concern, right, typical user to actually rely on the Apple, Google, or Microsoft ecosystem, or one of the password managers like 1Password and others, right, that we've kind of reviewed, to actually synchronize the passkey. So you can theoretically store the passkey on your mobile device, but in order for it to be truly portable and recoverable in case you lose your phone, you basically trust the Apple, keychain, and the synchronization of keychain ecosystem for most customers, or the Google Password Manager, to actually synchronize these passkeys, right, before you can log in. So that's a concern, right? For a lot of organizations, you do not want, right, all their customers to be potentially held, hostage by an outage of the Apple or Google ecosystem, right? So that can be a challenge.
It just seems like the term passwordless might be a misnomer. It's a little bit like that term serverless that we use in infrastructure and operations. Oh, there's still a server there, folks, somewhere. Okay, so we've got some of the options on the journey to eventual passwordless. How are these ideas progressing? Like, what is the state today and what's holding us back? And maybe, again, we could break it down for employees in the enterprise versus what's happening with consumers, because I think they're potentially on different trajectories. We'll see. So, Jeff, why don't you start us off? What's happening in the enterprise?
Yeah, so I think with enterprise, the barriers or obstacles to adoption have been largely around cost. And there are various elements to cost that we can certainly get into a bit more. But beyond that, technically, hardware compatibility is a big challenge and issue for enterprises, especially if they have aging IT tech out there and fielded. Legacy applications, in terms of the integration with applications, can be a challenge. So these are the primary issues we've seen. But again, a lot of it in the enterprise, I think, still comes back to cost justification. And that's what we saw in our 2023 Forrester security survey. 32% of folks found that justifying the cost of investment to senior management was the biggest obstacle to deploying passwordless in the workforce.
What about the mobile device? Like, most employees are going to have their laptop, and yeah, some of the laptops are enabled with like fingerprint authentication, for example. But are a lot of these dependent on an employee having a modern smartphone? Like, you've got to have Apple or an Android phone, and it's got to support some of these capabilities. And then does that lead into the question about whether it's corporate owned or corporate provided versus the employee owns it?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the predominant method going forward is really to, I think, as Andras pointed out earlier, utilize the mobile device, right? And that footprint or that real estate to provide for the authenticator estate. Oftentimes we're hearing challenges with, if it's BYOD, resistant to employees being resistant to having their own personal device used for corporate purposes, whether it's out of privacy concerns or just general pushback that if the company's not paying for it, I'm not going to allow it. And then even other things such as geographies and union contracts come into play. So all these different obstacles that make it much more difficult to think about when you're talking about that mobile device as the authenticator.
And Anders, what about on the consumer side? What is the state of things? Is it a bit different than employee side?
I think so. So I think we are a bit further ahead on the customer identity access management front. We asked in our security survey in 2023, the Forrester security survey in 2023, what are your organization's plans to adopt, the following identity access management technologies? And we found that, 89%, so almost 90% of customers' SIAM programs are actually adopting or planning to adopt multi-factor authentication. And obviously, most of MFA is passwordless. And 84% of customer SIAM programs are adopting or planning to adopt passwordless authentication, right? So this is generally a very encouraging sign. On the service provider side of things, we have Adobe, Apple, eBay, Google, Microsoft, PayPal, and a number of other providers, GitHub for developers, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Target. So it's just a ton of various, vertical consumer-facing websites actually have adopted passkeys. So that's a form of passwordless authentication. And then if a service provider is not yet ready for, passkeys adoption, they, still have moved, like Verizon or the Washington Post, they have moved to really silently, without telling anybody, to deprioritizing the password. So you're trying to log in and say Verizon, maybe they will not necessarily ask you for your legacy password, but they'll say, after you specify plug in your phone number or user ID, they'll send you a one-time passcode to your mobile device, to your SMS inbox, text message inbox, that you have to plug back in, and you're logged in. Or Microsoft is a good example. If you are on Live, right, the Microsoft 365 kind of non-paid version, and you have a Microsoft Authenticator application registered with Microsoft, and you're just trying to get on Hotmail, which is basically Outlook Live, they will not ask you. So you plug in your username, and the next thing you'll see is you're going to get a push notification to your mobile authenticator device, which is phishing resistant. They'll ask you, present a 2-digit number in the request in a browser that you will have to actually repeat from a multiple choice menu on the authenticator, and you're logged in. So it's really deprioritizing using passwords, I think, is another very good tactic that we're seeing here.
But it does seem like we all know it's a problem. We all know there's better alternatives out there. But on the employee side, there's a lot of resistance to the cost, and the employees themselves are resistant to the idea. Whereas on the consumer side, both the companies as well as the consumers seem to be embracing it, which is kind of interesting because a lot of times employees want at work what they have in their consumer life, which is, hey, it's so easy for me to log in my consumer life. I would like that at work. But it seems like we just haven't overcome those hurdles just yet.
Well, and I don't think with the user experience, I think the employees would embrace that. And especially from what I've heard from companies that have gone on this journey, what they hear back time and again from users is that once they go, why didn't we do this sooner? Why did I resist? When they've had the option to kind of get into their corporation's rollout plans for passwordless. Why did I hold back? It's so easy. I love it, So after the fact, the experience kind of kicks in. But up until that point, to get them moved over, it's just that fear and uncertainty that they have that resistance level they have to break down.
Yeah, it is interesting. Actually, your research director, Merritt Maxim, recently we were talking with a client and they were describing all the challenges they had with identity and access management. We kind of said at the end of the day, it's actually not a technology problem. It's more of a change management and cultural problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a huge part of it.
We see that cultural challenge as well as in the consumer space. So, very common inquiry that we get here is we, like a bank or e-commerce provider, has 95% of their users are savvy and they can download a mobile application or respond to SMS text messages and know how to handle, one-time use links. But there's always that long tail or kind of stubborn 5% of users, right, who are digitally unsavvy. They have never had any experience with a mobile phone. They don't even necessarily have a smartphone. What do you do with those folks, right? That's always a challenge and always an educational kind of conversation. So that is, having a tunable and workflowable and configurable user authentication flow is absolutely very important to kind of support all these types of user populations.
Well, passwords don't provide the greatest security any longer. There aren't, passwordless options aren't without their own risks. So what are some of the risks and some of the considerations? Like if we started breaking them down, like Andra actually mentioned one-time password over SMS, which seems popular with consumers. Like, yeah, I get to a website, I can remember my username. Don't ask me to remember my password. Send me a link.
So a number of things, right? So if you deliver one-time passwords or one-time use links, magic links, right, to an email address, if the hackers have already gotten hold of the user's email address, right, and they're reading the user's email, then this thing basically boils down and reduces security to the email, the personal email security of the user. So that's number one. Number two, and this is a problem in fraud management and not a lot of good solutions to this. If you deliver SMS text messages, right, with one-time passwords or one-time use links, if that if that phone number has been ported by the fraudster or has been SIM swapped, which is in essence, the fraudster takes over somebody's phone number, right, and basically the phone number now gets text messages in the fraudster's device, not the victim's device, right? That's a huge problem. And then lastly, I would say, this is more specific to passkeys than email and text message based OTP or link delivery. Relying on Google, Apple, Microsoft, and even a third-party tool, and the presence and the possession of the devices is a huge kind of challenge, right? For authentication. And then the last thing I would mention is basically the digitally unsavvy users, people who have no idea how to install a mobile app that does the authentication. They've never known a smartphone, and all the education of users that needs to happen when the transition to passwordless happens.
Yeah, Jeff, is it similar for employees?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the proof of possession when you're talking about employees is always a big kind of challenge and risk from a corporate risk standpoint. Looking at that, I think a lot of the risks from a security perspective come back around to lifecycle management. So, whatever the authenticator device or mechanism is, there's still a life cycle involved with it. So those are, I think, as the tech improves to strengthen kind of that runtime authentication, hackers are always looking to kind of circumvent or go around that through weaker processes or gaps in process. So I think you start to see those risks start to get more magnified, and the social engineering attacks, obviously, that we've seen kind of support that.
Are there industry differences for both consumers as well as for the enterprise? I mean, I feel like on the consumer side, passkeys were all the rage last year. Everybody was talking about passkeys. And a lot of that was for me, I noticed it with some of the consumer services, streaming services, like they were digital services, where I kind of saw the use of passkeys quite a bit. And then again, like on the industry side, like I think the companies that first really started talking about passwordless seemed to be all high tech, right? It was like all high tech vendors, high tech service providers. So just curious if there's been any industry differences, either in terms of how rapidly they're embracing this or how slow they've been.
Yeah, I would say high tech and financial services is where I've seen most of the beginnings of adoption. It does vary too. I think we get into a little bit more on the environments that these users are in. So if it's a knowledge worker versus a field worker, makes a big difference in terms of how easy it is maybe to deploy passwordless to the workforce that you have.
I was wondering, actually, you mentioned like the environment, like, and you mentioned field workers. Like on the one hand, I was thinking like they would actually potentially benefit the most from passwordless. Like they're out on the road, they're in the fields, and most of the time, I could be wrong about this, the company is issuing them some kind of device because it's the nature of their role that they actually need a corporate issued device.
Well, yeah, except I guess contrary to that is sort of the healthcare where there's a lot of shared device usage. That the shared device scenario, I think, is one of the ones that's a little bit more difficult to kind of figure out how to approach that. But yeah, like if it's a field technician or something, you're right in that typically they're carrying some sort of device with them, and that makes it a whole lot easier to execute if that's the method of operation.
So interestingly, in the financial services and banking space, things are moving probably the slowest here, right? Outside of the European Union. So in North America, we still see banks offering the old school, here's your username and then here's your password. And if it's a new device, we'll send you a text message or we'll send you a one-time use link, over typically on SMS these days. Or use a mobile authenticator device, like a mobile application for authentication on your mobile device, right? Versus the other verticals where the risk levels are lower, so this is multi-factor authentication in FIs for financial services. On the other hand, when you look at some of these other areas like Adobe, right? Once you establish a passkey, they will actually rely on that passkey, which you can think of as a more secure passwordless but single-factor authentication kind of method. So Financial services have not yet adopted passkeys, but other verticals, high tech, retail has, right? So very, very interesting. So kind of we're seeing a little bit of an opposite of what Jeff described on the employee workforce side of the house.
Yeah. One other question I have actually on one of the methods, which is biometric authentication. Again, it feels like years ago that was all the rage. Everybody was talking about biometric, and it seemed we reached to a certain level of adoption, and it's almost as if it leveled off quite a bit. And then I'm wondering, what will the impact of deepfakes have on future biometric authentication? Where, for a long time we're like, these AI systems are not going to come up with the accuracy to fool biometric authentication. It's like, oh no, sorry. Yeah, they can. So where are we with biometric authentication? Have we hit a brick wall until we could figure out how to deal with deepfakes?
I would say that 90% of the increase I've been taking in the past 12 months or in guidance sessions had a question about deepfakes, and customer authentication. So the situation is pretty bad. I think it's safe to conclude that voice biometrics today is a lot weaker, right, than it was, say, before deepfakes. The video-based or physical identity document verification, when you're looking at using video or pictures, right, is a little bit more secure because it's a lot harder to do good video-based deepfakes, right? But in general, this is something that every biometrics provider, including the voice biometrics vendors like Microsoft / Nuance or Verid, Auraya, and others, are actually feverishly working on deepfake detection and basically shutting out deepfakes. It's really difficult. There's also third-party point solution providers that are doing this. The challenge, right, around deepfakes, right, is not only with biometric authentication, but it's also with, like, what happens if a fraudster purports to be the CEO of a company and calling the CFO of the company and just instructing the CFO to transfer a large sum of money, right, from the company to a fraudster's account, right, using deepfakes. There's no or very difficult ways to control that channel, right? So that's a huge problem. So there's progress, right, in biometrics. So deepfakes are a huge challenge, and there's absolutely still the privacy concerns, right? The FAA, asking Department of Homeland Security, TSA, to actually reduce or pause the use of biometrics for exit controls in the United States airports. So there's a lot of kind of still, kind of tug of war around using biometrics in the consumer space.
And then back to the device, like whether you're talking employee, passwordless, or consumer, it's linked to the device. This idea that the device knows who you are, you own your device, you have your device in your possession. What happens if you change your device often? So that means the next time you go to your favorite website, your favorite mobile app, you have to start the process over again to establish the passkey?
So if you have an Apple ID and using Apple Keychain or using the Google Password Manager, and you're able to log in and you're able to synchronize all these services, then your passkeys will be synchronized alongside with your password, using the password combinations to the new device. But it takes time, it takes network bandwidth, it takes user kind of training. And again, it relies on the Apple, Google, and Microsoft ecosystems to do this synchronization, or 1Password or KeePass or other providers that do similar things, right?
Yeah. What about the employee side?
And the employee side, you want to, at this point, stay away from the syncable passkeys and stick with what they call device-bound passkeys. So these kind of harken back to the traditional FIDO that people think of in terms of the actual hardware security key. Those things are now being implemented within mobile apps to give you that FIDO, but you still have the issue of, to your point, if you replace your device, you're basically getting a new token. So, it's a whole process to have that replacement go through. And this goes back to the opportunity for, again, different malicious activities to occur when you kind of have the ability to do a replacement of a device without any proper, verification. Very important to make sure that life cycle is tight.
Yeah. So lots of options, but it sounds like almost all the options have considerations and have their own risks and their own costs on this journey. So if we were advising companies, let's start with the employer, the enterprise side, how would you advise them to get started, right? Because you've got to do something. You can't just continue to rely on.
Yeah, I think you need to start with, and I would start first and foremost with MFA in general. Let's get MFA in place. So first and foremost, let's
multi-factor authentication.
Yes,
yeah.
multi-factor.
Start with the basics.
Yes. Yeah. But beyond that, in terms of if you're going to get on this passwordless journey, I think you really have to do a lot in terms of discovery to understand your environment in terms of what are the use cases, what are these environments, going back to what I was mentioning earlier, and field workers, knowledge workers makes a difference in the approach you're going to take. Knowing what you have out there for endpoint devices, compatibility, all these things need to be kind of rooted out up front so that you can really devise a strategy that's going to allow you, put you on a path for success. So first and foremost, it's understanding your environment. Secondly, again, looking at it holistically, not just the authentication event itself, but all the different steps and user interactions along the way. And the user interactions being important, not only from security, in thwarting those hackers, but also from a user experience point of view. You want to make this, a very usable, convenient experience, so that there is strong adoption. So I think starting with those things, change management within the organization is huge. So starting that early, getting the communications, the awareness about what's going on. Again, it's a big cultural thing. So as much as some of these technology aspects and issues, it really needs to have a strong stakeholder value for kind of the change process. Okay.
Anders, what about on the consumer side? How do people get going on the consumer side? And here, it's interesting, we're talking about a totally different scale, right? I mean, a large company could be talking about tens of thousands of employees. On the consumer side, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of consumers, maybe even millions of consumers.
Millions,
so it is
tens of millions or hundreds of millions.
Yeah.
So lots of yes. So Jeff already mentioned this. So basically, you almost always want to have not just a security kind of argument when you're a CIAM department or SVP responsible for customer identity access management, security, or fraud, but also a customer experience and basically business benefits, business agility argument in there, right? That's the most important thing. Instead of just saying, hey, passwordless authentication is going to cause a gigantic headache for our customers and consumers because of all the behavioral changes that it will require. But everything's going to be great. We'll lock the bad guys out. You have to kind of start thinking about, the ease of authentication, right, with which the customers can actually log in. So that is super important, right, to find the business use case, the business benefits of being able to onboard more people, being able to convert more people, offer a much less an experience to consumers that does not have friction in it or has appropriate friction in it. So once you have it down and you're able to do, we call it alternatives testing or A/B testing. So you change some of your authentication flows or optionally for certain users, like the more savvy users or the younger generation, to passwordless, you watch these conversion rates, right? And if things go in the right direction, it's time to kind of broaden the deployment scale. The other thing that we've seen is basically organizations just looking at, as I said, silent kind of transitions, right? So if the service provider organization already has a mobile number of the user or an email address of a user, which is highly likely, right? And these days you have a verified email and have a verified text message capable mobile phone, you just say, hey, we sent you, the user types in their username, and then instead of prompting the user to type in their password, you just tell them, we sent you to this phone number a one-time use password. Can you please plug it in this box? That's all it is. So it's instead of forcing the password to be used, you just basically go to a one-time password-based experience for the customer. Or better yet, if the organization issued a mobile application, like there's an eBay app, like in Google, with a YouTube application these days, is basically sending push notifications to customers when you're trying to log in on a new device. You plug in your user ID, and then it'll say that without asking anything, that we see that you have YouTube installed on this other device. We sent you a push notification. Please open up YouTube on this other device and check the notification, and the user will see a green button or red button. Yes, it was me, or it wasn't me. And that's that simple. So it's really, making, like Jeff said, the customer experience and the flow a lot simpler.
Okay. So a lot of great content, guys, a lot of good recommendations. So I think to end us, I'm going to ask each of you for a prediction. How long until passwords are a thing of the past? And then what happens between now and then? So we'll start with you, Jeff, talk about on the employee side.
Yeah, on the employee side, I'd like to say it'd be like tomorrow. But, realistically, I think it's probably 3 years, maybe even extending out beyond that, just to where it's predominantly, passwordless is your main mechanism and your predominant mechanism for authentication. I do think it's sort of one of these things that it's going to be gradually and then all of a sudden, right?
Yeah. Is there a tipping point? Like, is there something in the technology, like once XYZ is available, that's the tipping point that's going to push everybody over? Is it a cost thing, an experience thing?
Yeah, I think that's what makes it hard to predict, because I think it's so many variables that sort of enter in, on the workforce side anyway.
All right. Jeff gave me a very consultative answer.
That's a consultant answer.
That's all right. We'll let you go. We'll let you go on that one. All right, Andras, strong prediction on the consumer side.
Sure. I'd say between 2 to 3 years, 80% of service providers, maybe non-banks, right, will be on some kind of a passwordless, at least optionally available, or FIDO to passkeys, being usable. The reason I'm saying this, right, PSD2 in Europe mandated essentially passwordless authentication. It's just two-factor, but all the banks just went all the way to passwordless. PSD3 coming up and again in the EU asks for much greater liabilities for FIs to bear, for fraud, right? So this basically will force banks and FIs to upgrade their authentication framework. So I think Europe is all set. Most of the EU banks are making passwordless authentication available, as opposed to North American banks. It's a little bit bifurcated. PCI DSS 4.0 that starts in March 2025, going into effect then, will mandate better secure authentication, data management. So that will also have an impact on pretty much every e-commerce provider, retailer is subject to PCI DSS. So these are all accelerators that, again, make me just believe or expect that within 2 to 3 years, 80% of service providers will actually at least offer options to avoid using passwords on a routine basis. So that's a pretty high number.
I like it. We'll see you back here in 2 years. Great. Well, fantastic. Well, gentlemen, I think that brings us to the end. I just want to thank you both.
Thanks. Enjoyed being here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.